Theoretically. Good morning. Welcome to our service. We're going to get going in a couple minutes, and Jacob and Jenny are going to be playing some music until then. Enjoy.
Good morning, Instagram family. We're going live at Crossing Community Church. Happy Easter! Do you want that there or no?
That's fine. Just can't hit right there. Good morning, Facebook community. Thank you for joining us. And I did figure out how to cut this out.
Oh, cool.
This first part of the video.
Cool. Oh, there's a yellow thing on the YouTube
Yeah.
You can move mine if it's
It's all right.
annoying.
Oh dear, let's not do that.
You want me to do something?
It is sliding. Okay, we're just going to run with it.
YouTube is working?
I can't guarantee that.
Oh.
Okay.
Good morning. Happy Easter, Crossing Community Church. We are praying that this morning you're enjoying the sunshine and you are just feeling the Lord's presence. We just pray that you would invite him into your hearts and your minds right now as we begin to sing, that he is worthy of all of our praise this morning because he is risen indeed. Let's sing. Who breaks the power of sin and darkness, whose love is mighty and so much stronger, the King of glory, the King above all kings, who shakes the whole earth with holy thunder, who leaves us breathless in awe and wonder, the King of glory, the King of His word, my hope secures. He will my shield and portion as long as life shall soon dissolve like snow. The sun forbear to shine, but God who called me here below will be forever mine. The God who called me here below will be forever mine. Lord God, we thank you so much for your grace. Lord, we thank you for sending your Son. God, we thank you that we are here this morning to be able to praise you and lift you up and honor you with our songs, with our words, with our thoughts, and all that we say and do, Lord, may it be pleasing to you. God, as we sing one more song this morning, we just ask that you would put someone on our hearts to be praying for, who may have been wandering from you, or even if it's us, God, one of us who are in the church body who wandered away from your goodness, God, from knowing your faithfulness. Would you remind us of that this morning, Lord? We just pray, Lord, that you would remind us that we can come as we are. Lord, that we can be at your feet just as we are. Lord, would you stir in our hearts someone to pray for this morning? Even if it's in our church body, Lord, or in our family, Lord, who we may not be able to see today, God, would you put someone on our hearts that they would hear your message and your word and your goodness this morning, God, that they would lay down their burdens and just come as they are. Come out of sadness from wherever you've been. Come broken-hearted, let rescue begin. Come find your mercy, oh sinner, come near. Earth has no sorrow this morning. We thank you for all that you've done and all that you're doing in us and through us as a church body, as a community of believers. God, we ask that you would tug at people's hearts today, that you would soften people's hearts today, that you would help us to encourage people even if we can't be close to them today, God. May we remind them that they can come as they are, we can come as we are. Lord, help us to be still in front of you today and help us to rejoice in all that you've done. In Jesus' name we pray. And everybody said,
Amen.
Amen. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Jenny and Jacob. That was pretty awesome. Welcome to you, wherever you're at, on our streaming, whether you're on Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube. We're thankful that you're joining with us today, and especially today, right? Today is the day that if you are a believer in Jesus, this is our day. This is the big deal. This is Easter. This is the day that we celebrate not the death of Jesus, but the resurrection of Jesus. And the good news is made tangible to us through the resurrection. Now, we have been looking at, if you've been joining us recently, we've been looking at what it means to have peace. Peace is a very scarce commodity in our world today. And the Bible gives us a lot of indications about what it means to have peace. And the word it uses is the word shalom. And shalom means an internal peace, and that's definitely true. But it also means a peace of that everything works together in the right way that God intended it to work. It's an internal peace of I can be at rest, but it's also a peace around us, a peace in relationship, a communal peace. It's a peace that doesn't waver with the tide, and that's the kind of peace that we need now more than ever. So we have been looking actually at Isaiah the last couple days, Isaiah chapters 52 and 53. So if you have a device or if you have a Bible in front of you or whatever, go ahead and turn there. That's going to be the main part of what we look at today. Now, Isaiah 52 begins with an amazing vision that he has. Isaiah is a prophet, and he is prophesying that there's going to be some bad stuff happen. That's kind of the most of Isaiah. They're going to be taken away. And then there's going to be some good stuff happen. And that's where Isaiah 52 starts to shift. And that good stuff is brought about by the entrance of this person, this guy that Isaiah calls the servant. And this messenger or this servant is coming on hills. It's like they're watching from the walls of Jerusalem, and coming at them from very far away is this guy. And you know he's coming to bring good news because the exiles have happened and they're waiting to hear if everything is okay and everything is going to be okay. And this messenger comes. And the Bible says, and Isaiah tells us, that the feet of the messenger make the mountains beautiful. The message is so awesome and amazing. Now, the message that he gives, that he provides to the city, this messenger, this servant, is one of peace, one of shalom, one of salvation, which the Hebrew word there is Yeshua, which we get Jesus' name from. And he also says he's going to bring glad tidings or good tidings, which is what the angel announces when Jesus is pointing glad tidings of great joy. So this messenger is bringing amazing news about something that's going on. And then in Isaiah 52, he kind of shifts from that messenger to the servant. So we learn that this messenger is a servant of a king. It's a king that lives far away. And it's a king that is sending this messenger to do something for us that we couldn't do for ourselves. And we learn in the beginning of Isaiah chapter 53 that this servant is going to go through a lot of pain. He's going to have a really rough time of it. But we're going to pick up in the end of chapter 53. And Dave Phillips, I just want you to know that you are a funny man. So I'm going to read the end of chapter 53 here. Yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. he has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring, and he shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. Out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong. Because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors, yet he bore the sins of many, and makes intercession for the transgressors. Now, that's not all of Isaiah's vision of the suffering servant. Keep going in chapters 54 and on, but I'll let you read that on your own. We're going to camp right now on those 3 verses that I just read. Now, whenever you read a passage of Scripture, ask yourself a couple questions. It's always good to ask yourself the investigating questions, the who, what, where, when, and why, right? Those are great questions. And then you kind of get to the next layer. After you've answered those questions, you get to the layer of, in the Bible, repetition is used as a way to emphasize things. So it's almost like if things are repeated, there's like an exclamation mark at the end of whatever the repeat is. And we're going to look at 3 different things today that were repeated throughout 52 and 53, and especially these verses. Now, the first thing that we've already said something about that was repeated is this servant had a rough time of it. The servant had to go through a ton of suffering. And I picked out some of these repeats. Again, this isn't a repeat of words per se, but it's a repeat of ideas. And always keep a lookout for that. So here's a couple things that 52 and 53 tell us about this servant. It says that his appearance was marred beyond human recognition. He was despised and he was rejected. He was crushed for our transgressions. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. God's punishment brought us peace, and by his wounds we're healed. He was oppressed and he was afflicted. By judgment and oppression he was taken away. God crushed him. He put him to grief. The servant's soul was in anguish, and he poured out his soul unto death. Now, that is a rough time of it. So why all the suffering for God's servant? Like, what was the point of this stuff? Now, we're looking back on this servant, and we understand that this servant is an image of Jesus. Right? This is a forecast of Jesus to come. And we see on the cross and on the way to the cross, Jesus went through so much for us. So why? What was the point of all of this suffering? So there's 3 different kind of things, 3 different angles that we can look at this suffering from. Now, the first angle is that it's clear that this was a very intentional gauntlet that the servant had to go through. The servant had to go through this for a purpose. Now, this purpose was to do something about a problem that we could never do on our own. And that was do something about our sin problem. I mean, we think corona is a problem right now, and it is a huge problem, and I understand people are dying from it, but it is not the ultimate problem that we face. What we face is a sin problem. Because our sin problem is going to determine what happens to us after we die, not just lead us to. We're all going to pass away at some point in time. And how we deal with this problem of disconnection from God is how we're going to spend eternity. And so Jesus came to do something about that. That's the vision of the suffering servant. And it's honestly, the idea here is that the suffering maybe had to happen because it had to appease God's wrath. And the big picture word for this is propitiation. That's a 25-cent word. A big theological word. But it is basically the idea that sin happened. It separated us from God, and that by our choices, both made for us and made by us, that we have offended God. And that offense something needs to happen because of that. And the idea here is that God didn't allow us to take the brunt of that offense, of our own offense. That we deserved punishment. And that God didn't give it to us, he gave it to himself. Now, let's make sure that we don't go a little bit out of balance with this, right? There's been a lot of writings in Christianity that pictures God as this vengeful, awful God, this dad who is running around trying to punish everybody for every little thing that they've done wrong. And I don't think that's God's motive here. Remember, God takes the punishment upon himself. God sent the servant. God sent the servant. We know that Jesus was God. God gave the punishment for himself. So let's not get out of balance with any kind of Jonathan Edwards, sinners in the hands of an angry God kind of an idea, because I don't think that's the God that we serve. And if you don't know what that is, that's okay. Google it sometime. It's a pretty rough sermon that somebody thought up. But I just don't picture God that way. I don't picture him in the New Testament that way, and I don't think even the Old Testament pictures him that way. Because we know that God is a God of care and compassion, a God of ultimately peace. So why did God have to suffer? I mean, yes, there's a facet that sin caused suffering, and that God was going to do whatever it took to deal with the sin problem. And that's a beautiful thing. But there's a couple other reasons too. When Jesus came, there's this thing called the incarnation, and Jesus came as 100% God and 100% human. He could never leave that duality. He had to be 100% God and 100% human. And I think one of the reasons why Jesus suffered so much on the cross was because it was the devil trying to go, hey, I've got one last ditch effort before this thing goes through. I think the devil knew what was going on. I think he knew that he was defeated after this. And he was going to do whatever it took to try to get Jesus' humanity to trump his divinity. When Jesus is hanging on that cross and he's feeling every pain, when he's going to the cross and he's feeling every whip, Jesus had to be going, what am I doing this for? This hurts. This is awful. And he had to be thinking, hey, I could get out of this. I'm God. I mean, one snap of my fingers and all this goes away, right? Now, that would have meant Jesus sinned, and it would have derailed the whole process, and I think the devil knew that. And the suffering that Jesus took for us and upon himself, I think, was a temptation, which in some ways is really interesting, because the writer of Hebrews says that Jesus was tempted in every way, yet was without sin. There's nothing that we can do or could experience that he hasn't already experienced. So there's comfort in that, right? We know that a God who sent himself to solve our problem didn't pad himself from the consequences of being human. And in that way, that leads us to him fully embracing being God, being human. In order for Jesus to fully embrace that, he had to feel these things. He had to feel what we feel. And there are times when we hurt physically, when we hurt relationally and we hurt emotionally. And Jesus felt it all. Every last piece of it. All the way to the very end. Now, as Jesus was suffering on the cross, there's something that happened that gives us a really clear indication, a really clear vision and picture of what was going on through the agony of the cross. I'm going to read you Luke chapter 23. I'm going to begin at verse 44. Now, there's an image in here that we may pass over and miss, but it's a very, very vivid image that a Jewish person reading Luke's good news would have caught. It was about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour, while the sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, calling out in a loud voice, said, "Father, into my hands I commit your spirit. Into your hands I commit my spirit." And having said this, he breathed his last. Now when the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God, Yahweh, the Jewish God, saying, "Certainly this man was innocent." This was a Roman soldier. And all the crowds that had assembled for this spectacle, when they saw what had taken place, they returned home beating their chests. And all his acquaintances and the women who had followed him from Galilee stood at a distance watching these things. Now, this is what was happening as Jesus was dying. Now, there's one sentence in there that is easy to pass over. Of all of the stuff that's going on, all of the people that are watching this amazing occurrence and saying, this isn't right. What is going on here? Something amazing has happened. It says here a little detail. It says, and the temple of the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Now, some of you, if you're around Valparaiso and I brought you a package, have a little piece of purple cloth in your package. Get it out now. And I don't know that this was the color of the temple curtain, but this represents the curtain of the temple to us today. Now, what the curtain of the temple was, is there were various layers of the temple in Jerusalem. And different people could go in different places within that temple. And the most inner part of the temple was called the Holy of Holies. And in the Holy of Holies, one priest once a year could go into that place and do one thing alone. And that was offer a sacrifice for the guilt of his people. One person, once a year. You know what separated that Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant stayed? What separated that from the rest of the temple? It was a curtain. It was a very thick curtain, a curtain that no one ever saw into because no one else was allowed to go in there. This was the most special place anywhere. This was the picture of God's holiness. And the curtain was torn in two. Now, I don't know if I'll be able to do this. I started it, but it's really thick. So I'm going to cut it because I can't even rip it apart. That was about the curtain in the temple. The curtain was really, really, really thick. No one could have done this on their own. The curtain was cut in two. When the curtain was cut in two, everybody was allowed to see in. This thing that separated God's picture of holiness from humanity. This picture that God was holding back and restraining from what we deserved was ripped in two. Because that distance no longer needed to be distant anymore. It wasn't that even so much we are allowed to go in now or we are allowed to investigate the Holy of Holies. It's that God came out. This was no longer holding him in because he didn't have to be anymore, because there was now an opportunity for us to relate to him. He came to solve the problem that we couldn't solve on our own. And what separated us no longer needs to separate us anymore. The suffering that Jesus made on the cross ripped this in two. And it brought him out of the building. And now he has the opportunity to reside in a new kind of building. And that's why he built us, is to reside inside us and with us, and for us to have our lives centered on him and to be at home with him. See, we don't have to go to a temple. We don't have to go to a church. I'm in our church right now, but we don't have to go here. The church, this is just a bunch of bricks and sticks. The real church is here. It's God living inside of us, and when we get together, we become this movement of called out ones that are sent, just like our messenger was sent to us. We get to go and be sent to others. That is a beautiful message. And that, my friends, that is a message of peace. Now, what really did Jesus offer of himself for us? Well, there's another repetition here. There's another repetition in these three verses. And if you look down, and each verse here says the word soul. Now, this guy offered, the messenger, the servant, was offering his soul. It was an anguish of soul, and he offered us his soul. Now, what does this mean? In a Hebrew word, this is the Hebrew word nephesh. And this word literally means kind of all of us. It's an embodiment of who we are. Our soul, we don't so much have a soul as we are a soul. Well, think about that for a second. It's not that our soul, when we die, goes to heaven, because we are a soul. The soul isn't a piece of us inside of us. Our soul is the entirety of us. That's the biblical picture of what Jesus offered for us. It was all of himself. It wasn't just his physical pain, and which we talk about a lot at this time of year. It wasn't just that he suffered physically. Jesus took the sin of the entire world upon himself. The perfect one was now no longer perfect. And he was not just a little bit imperfect. He took the entire sin of everybody from all time on himself. He offered everything that he had, every bit of his humanity and every bit of his divinity for us. He offered his soul for us. Now, that's a pretty amazing idea to think about, right? That there was no part of Jesus that he withheld for himself. No part of God that he said, well, this is off limits to y'all. He said, here I am. I offer you everything that I am, and he dies. He died for us. Now, what did he offer himself for? There's another series of repetitions here in this passage, and it doesn't paint a very pretty picture of what he offered himself for. The next repetition is a repetition of words that revolve around the idea of sin. If you look back in chapter 53, we're going to begin in verse 10. Lists the word guilt. And in some translations, you see this as he gave himself as a guilt offering for us. Now, this idea of guilt is the idea that you don't know, you've done something, but you don't really know what you've done cognitively. So here's a good picture for us that I know has happened to nobody out there, but maybe has happened to me, maybe. That you're driving down the road, right? And you're minding your own business. Maybe you're singing out your window or doing whatever. Just, it's a beautiful day and you kind of forget where you're at and what you're doing. And your foot gets a little heavy. And all of a sudden, you see the cop car lights in the background and you're going, oh no, what did I do? And you look down and you think that you saw your speedometer go a little bit too much to the right. Cop comes up to you, pulls you over, and you get your license and title out and insurance and all this stuff. And the cop comes to the knocks on your door and says, sir or ma'am, do you know how fast you were going? And you look at her or him and go, yeah, I know. And they say, well, you were going, you were going 70 in a 55 or whatever it is. And you kind of think to yourself, I had no idea, I'm sorry. Well, do you think the policeman is going to just go, well, you didn't know. So, no, the policeman's supposed to give you a ticket. Ignorance is no spot to get out of a ticket. If you did the crime, you did the time. You pay the fine. That's what guilt is. Guilt is doing something that you didn't know that you were doing, but you did it wrong anyway, and you should have a consequence for that. That's guilt. What did Jesus come for? To save us from? He came to save us from our guilt. Now, the next verse has another word for sin in it, and it uses the word iniquity, and that is throughout this passage in 52 and 53 a lot. He uses the word iniquity, and it's the second most frequent word used for this concept of sin. The idea of iniquity here is that there is something that you did wrong that you either didn't know was wrong or that you really didn't understand was going on. But it's a violation that you kind of knew was wrong, but you kind of pushed into anyway. There's some fuzziness about whether it was a clear volition, but you knew it was generally not a good idea to do. And it's a pretty generic term. Like our speeding illustration, many of us speed because we think we can get away with it. Not because we don't think speeding is going to cost us money or is wrong. We speed because we think we can get away with it. Our motive is different in it, right? In our first illustration, we weren't thinking. We weren't paying attention to what's going on outside us. But in iniquity, we kind of knew what we were doing and we were trying to save time. Iniquity is full of excuses. Well, I just kind of wanted to do this and shave it off of that. And it wasn't so bad, right? That word that I said really didn't hurt him that bad. That's what iniquity is. Jesus came to save us from our iniquities. He came to save us from that stuff that we like to make excuses for because we like to toggle into the gray to the black areas of our life. There's another word here in verse 12, and that's the word transgression. Now, there's no vagueness about transgression. This is the most aggressive of these four words that the Bible uses. Transgression is a direct violation. It's a willful act. I know exactly what I'm doing, and I'm going to do it anyway. It literally means to push away from or to violate. And we all have been guilty of transgressions at different times. I know the right that I should do and I'm not going to do it. Or I know the wrong that I should not do and I'm going to embrace that. Transgression is something that we immediately feel oftentimes a sense of guilt. We do something and God says, hey, you shouldn't do it. You shouldn't do it. And you do it anyway, and then you feel it. And then the next day, maybe you feel the shame of it. And that shame cycles maybe you back into doing it again because you realize that there's no way that I should have done this. And in retrospect, there's no reason that God should forgive me for doing it. And yet God still came to do something about our transgressions. Now, the last word here is literally the word sin. In English, that's what it's translated. And sin is definitely the biggest, most generic version of this. And it just simply means to miss. In the New Testament, it's to miss the mark. So you think about if you've got a bullseye on a wall and you're throwing darts against that bullseye and you just simply don't hit the middle all the time. Because who can hit the middle all the time? That's a miss. Jesus came to save us from our misses. Now, for a lot of us, what this miss means is a motive. You know, you can do the right thing for the wrong reason and it still be the wrong thing. You can even do good for the wrong reason and it taints it. Jesus came to save us from our guilt, the stuff that we didn't know we were doing. Jesus came to save us from the things that we kind of knew were wrong, but we were willing to go near the line of. Jesus came to save us from our transgressions when we said, screw it, I'm going, I don't care what anybody says. And Jesus came to save us from those times where we did the right thing maybe, but we missed the mark. Now, if you think about Jesus giving his whole soul, his whole self on the cross for us, he gave his whole self for us, for this picture of us. He gave his whole self so that we could be accounted righteous, it says. So that junk, that all of us junk, right, could be done away with. That we could have the ability to overcome this now. This stuff wouldn't need to get us stuck anymore. Everything that we've done and everything that we've done to it, that's been done to us, can be overcome. We now have the strength to rise to the standard. Jesus didn't bring the standard down to us. He caused us, through his strength and love and grace and peace, to be able to rise to it. Not by our own behavior. Because heaven knows we're never going to get out of this side of heaven. But it was Jesus' sacrifice for us that caused us, literally in this passage, to be accounted as righteous. Because he bore the sin of many. And he's constantly pleading for mercy on behalf of those who are blatant violators of the law. Isn't that good news? To me, that's amazing news. It tells me that those things that I have in that closet somewhere in my life that I go, I don't really want to get that stuff out. It's the whole cartoon closet that, when Bugs Bunny or somebody goes up to the closet and they open the closet and everybody's going, don't open the closet. And the closet just kind of cascades all the junk out on Bugs Bunny. And it's really funny in a cartoon. It's not really funny when it happens to us in life. When the stinky skeletons in the closet want to come out and we're going, I don't know about that. That's too much. Well, in those moments, please be reassured. There ain't no too much. You are never too much for God. Never. No one anywhere has been. From Jeffrey Dahmer to Mother Teresa, from the worst to the best, it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what you've done. It matters what Jesus did for us, because we all suffer from these same maladies. There's none of us that isn't weighed down by our junk and by our sin. And yet God gave all of himself for all of us. That, my friends, is a beautiful thing. Now, the reason that God did this, and I'm going to read a little bit of chapter 54 here, was because Jesus didn't stay dead, did he? Jesus rose from the dead. The Romans killed a lot of people. Lots and lots and lots of people. And I guarantee you, not all of them were guilty. Just like not everybody who is on death row today is guilty. So dying, even as a person who didn't do the crime that got you there, didn't qualify you to be God. It was Jesus' sinless life that qualified him, and the strength of God that raised him from the dead that gave us this opportunity for a new resurrection kind of life. And Isaiah foresaw this, kind of. Let me read chapter 54, verses 9 and 10. This is like the days of Noah to me, as I swore that the waters of Noah should no more go over the earth. So I have sworn that I will not be angry with you and will not rebuke you. For the mountains may depart and the hills may be removed, but my steadfast love shall not depart from you. And my covenant of shalom, my covenant of peace, shall not be removed, says the Lord who has compassion on you. God sent us this messenger so that to deal with our sin problem. And he did that through rising from the dead to break the bondage of sin, so that we might know him both today and forever. Now, there's a saying in the early church that Jesus kind of connected people together. A saying that you said when you greeted people that identified you kind of as a Christian. I just got back from Nepal, and I saw this every day in Nepal. This is pretty awesome. The regular greeting from everyone in Nepal is namaste. And namaste literally means, I see the God in you. It's a Hindu saying. Now, Christians, when Christianity first came to Nepal, decided that I don't want to do that because that's not kind of what I believe. And they came up with a new greeting to greet each other. And their greeting is Jemasi. It's a mashup of two words. It's a mashup of Jesus, Messiah. Really. And that's how they describe it to me. And what it means to them is that they associate with Jesus' victory, with Jesus being the Messiah, with Jesus being the good news for us. And so every time you go around anywhere, and we were on the street sometimes, we would either be greeted with namaste, or we would be greeted with Jemasi. And when we were greeted on the street with Jemasi, we were like, yeah, you're one of us. That's pretty awesome. Now, people in the early church had that same greeting. They would say to each other, he's risen. If they thought somebody was a Christian, and the person who was a Christian back would say, he is risen indeed. That's the card. If you have your packages, that's the card. That's the call of Easter, right? He is risen, and he is risen indeed. So if you are at home and you have somebody around you, I want you right now just to say, he is risen to them, and the other person say, he is risen indeed. Go ahead, Jacob and Jenny.
He is risen indeed.
Woo! Guys, and this is good news. The four of us sitting here in church, we're doing what we can, you know? Social distance, it's okay. But guys, this is the good news. It's the good news that Jesus didn't stay dead. Romans crucified a lot of people. Jesus was the only one that came back. My friends, this is good news because it allows us to have peace now. It says that's one of the reasons he came to offer himself. This servant was for our peace, was for our shalom. If you're sitting there and you feel lonely, I understand. I do too sometimes. If you feel like maybe you're not seen, not understood, maybe you're struggling with something that you wanted to keep hidden, but you feel so darn lonely that you can't seem to get out of it now. Maybe you feel a little bit hopeless and you're doubting a little bit. I understand. Sometimes I feel that way too. But guys, Jesus came to do something for us that we could never do for ourselves. He came to give all of himself, all of his soul, his amazing, fully God and fully human soul. He gave all of himself for us, for me. The person who is bogged down by guilt and iniquity and transgression and sin and all of the stuff that makes us so very fallen and so very human. God came to embrace us and offer us a way for us to know him. Not to pull the bar down for us and to just let it be okay, but to pull us up to his joy and his truth and his standards. Now, there's one more thing we're going to do today, this morning. And if you have the grape juice or whatever this grape juice-ish substance is, feel free to get that out. And if you don't have a cup, feel free to go. This is one of April's mugs. I thought this was pretty funny. So how does that make you feel? Anyway, get yourself some grape juice. So we're going to take communion. Now, the day that Jesus was betrayed, the night, he was doing something that Jewish folks had been doing for generations. He was taking Passover. And part of the Passover meal was various cups of wine. And Jesus got to one of them and said, hey, guys, from now on, when you do this, as often as you do this, think of me. This isn't just the wine of that sheep that was slain long ago to keep the nation of Israel safe in Egypt. This is now my blood that is going to be spilled for you. And he said, every time you do this, remember me, my friends. Today, let's take a sip of the wine, of the grape juice, whatever you have, of the Kool-Aid, and think about that Jesus paid it all for us. And in that same ceremony, there was some flatbread that was being passed around, a couple different ones in Passover. If you have your little bags, that's little saltines. Thanks, Joel and Yoder, for the saltines. And to take those out. And if they're crushed up, that's okay. Because that's what Jesus said. He said, hey guys, when you do this, and he tore a piece of the flatbread off. He said, as often as you do this, remember that my body is going to be broken for you. It's going to be broken for your healing. So every time you do this, think of me. Let's take the bread. Now, this is what Jesus did for us. Let's offer ourselves in the same way to those around us. Find someone today to serve. Find someone today to encourage. Because we have a new life and we have new hope. Go in God's peace.